We've talked previously about phase one of the Russian military operation, and I talked about maneuver warfare and how the Russians used what I call a feint or a diversionary attack movement on Kiev to make it look like they were threatening Kiev, to freeze Ukrainian forces in place and to get Ukrainian reserves committed to that front. And I talked about maneuver warfare and how the Russians were masters of that art. It appears the Ukrainians have been mastering it as well, because the Russians use something to call a fire kettle. It's in their artillery doctrine, it's maneuver by fire, which means that as the enemy advances, you break up their advance with artillery coming in. You have strong points that channel the enemy into kill zone. And then the artillery comes in and pounds them, and bam, they're all dead. Kherson was set up doctrinally. It worked. Kharkov was different. And it shouldn't have been different. And this is where we get to the crux of the issue here. In Kharkov, we had two of the premier fighting forces in the Russian military, the 1st Guards Tank Army and the 20th Combined Arms Army, units that had a great history dating back to World War II. They were decommissioned at the end of the Cold War. But in 2016, the Russians brought them back. Why? Because it looked like NATO in Russia were starting to heat things up. NATO was deploying these battle groups into the Baltics, into Poland. And so the Russians rebuilt these units. And these units were configured for big arrow offensive and defensive operations. They were designed to fight a NATO enemy. That's just the reality of conflict. Conflict is cyclical, especially offensive conflict. And the Russians, since they transitioned to phase two at the end of March, have been on the offensive in a consistent fashion with no major pauses. And finally, the Russians said, we're pausing in August. We're hitting the pause button because these units are worn out. Even though they're winning, you can only go on the attack for so long. At some point in time, you got to say, boss, time out. We got to go back. We got to eat. We got to sleep. We got to take showers. Guys got to make phone calls home. We got to, refit, get ammunition. We got to get our equipment repaired. We got to get us repaired. Basically, it's a pause for the cause. Every military does it. When we went into Baghdad or in Iraq in 2003, we had to pause outside of Baghdad as prior to the Karbala offensive. We had to take a pause because we had outrun our logistics. We had to hit a halt, get the logistics to catch back up to us and all that stuff. And that was only after a period of a couple of weeks. The Russians have been doing this for 5 months. So they hit the pause button. And the other thing is the Russians were preparing for their own offensive in the autumn offensive. In order to prepare for that, they had to withdraw units back to Russia and get them up. And some of the units they withdraw came from the 1st Guards Tank Army, 20th Combined Arms Army. So now you have a weakened force structure in Kharkov. Normally what happens when you withdraw frontline units, you'll bring in designated reserves of similar capacity, similar capability, and they'll replace you. And you can maintain your doctrinal defensive alignment. The Russians didn't do this, though, for some reason. In certain sectors of the Kharkov front, instead of putting conventional rifle battalions on the front line, they put special police units, OMON, SOBR, SOBR. They put militia units from the Donetsk People's Militia. They put National Guard units, which are, just a fancy name for Ministry of Interior troops. And these guys don't have the same doctrine. They don't have the same training. They don't have the same equipment. And you put them on the front line of a major combat area. And not only that, they didn't put enough of them there. So whereas in Kherson, when you had one strong point in a village and another strong point in a village, you might have a kilometer gap between them. That's enough for them to have effective fires to block that. In Kharkov, sometimes you had 5 kilometers. Where was the artillery? They had stripped all the artillery away to go to Donbass to wage that meat grinding combat we talked about. That's very successful in that slow but steady advance through the Donetsk People's Republic. Where Wagner is doing the outstanding fighting. Again, outstanding from a military professional sense. I'm not taking sides here. The performance that Wagner's doing outside of Bakhmut is needs to be commended. from a professional standard. They're succeeding, but they succeed because they have a lot of fire support, and that fire support came from other units that were stripped away, and this was done in Kharkiv, which should have happened if you're going to thin out the ranks, but they didn't have that. And here's where it gets. This is the problem. So there's a sloppiness, there's a complacency that took place upon the Russian command, and then there's an intelligence failure, because everybody on the internet knew the Ukrainians were building up their forces. And if we know that, there has to be the Russian equivalent of Scott Ritter, who's watching that as well, looking at it going, holy beep, they're building up their forces. Well, this is the thing. What happened? First thing is the Ukrainians have the benefit because they're a NATO army now. So they have the benefit of American and NATO intelligence. So they're getting the extremely high
right. I saw in the Telegraph, they're saying the British and American intelligence were working in tandem with the Ukrainians. So they're
working
sort
in
of,
tandem.
They're already
they were
admitting
doing it. And that's the reality. So now the Russians have a choice. Do we fight and die in this big mobility battle in Kharkiv? Because they could have. I mean, they have reserves. They have limited reserves. They could have gone in and tried to blunt the Ukrainian attack, get involved in this, who can outflank whom, etc. But here's the issue. The Ukrainians have the advantage. The Russians are in reactive mode. And somebody finally woke up in the Russian high command and went, we're getting our butts kicked. So what do we do about this? Do we sacrifice our men, try and hold on to worthless territory? Because what does Kharkiv Oblast bring to Russia in the big picture? Not a darn thing. So are we going to sacrifice everybody in this kind of Manstein type, post-Stalingrad maneuver outside of Kharkiv in World War II? Or are we going to preserve the most precious resource we have, which is our manpower? And remember, it's even more precious when you're dealing with a military capped at 200,000 because of the special military operation. So do you really want to sacrifice 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 Russians and the political consequences of waking up in the morning, seeing thousands of prisoners being paraded down Stepan Bandera street in Kiev? Oh, so they took their reserves, they forced their way through the Ukrainian forces, and they rescued those police units. The ones that I was making fun of early on, I ain't making fun of them anymore, because those son of a guns, they fought like bandits. They dug in, they didn't surrender, they didn't retreat, they didn't panic. They're not trained, equipped, or whatever to deal with armor, mechanized infantry. And I say this as a military professional, hats off to you guys, because you stood your ground like the heroes you are, and you blunted the Ukrainian offensive. You prevented the biggest breakthrough. It's like, if I got a bunch of water coming down the street and I put a bunch of rocks in the middle of the street, I'm going to break up the water. The water's still going to go. It's going to flow around and move, but it's not going to go down as high a pace. These guys were the pile of rocks, and they're in the Ukrainian advance. And they stood their ground, fought bravely, they didn't surrender, and then they were rescued, and they were pulled out. And again, I mean, when the history's written about this, these are one of those moments where you realize how brave the Russians are. I mean, and I'm not denigrating the Ukrainians. I already told you. You know what kind of courage it takes to do the offensive that they've done?
Right.
These are the biggest cojones in the world. The Ukrainians are brave. They're gallant. You behaved well in the retreat, but it's a retreat. This wasn't planned. You didn't mean to do it.
Right.
You had to do it.
That was my main question, because
they had to do it.
There's both sides, like you just said. People saying that no, this was tactical, and others saying like no, you were on the run. On the run is a little too harsh too. On the run, the Russians never lost control.